A great Christian once said, "Earth has no sorrow that heaven cannot heal." That's what I'd like to talk about this morning, how God works to heal the sorrow, the emotional pain in our lives, particularly that deepest pain, which is grief. As we all well know, bereavement, the pain of loss, is an absolutely unavoidable aspect of life and also quite frequently one of the most difficult and troubling to overcome. A pioneer in grief research writes, "There is no dimension of life in which the stakes are higher in terms of human wholeness than in the experience of grief. Grief is involved in all significant changes, losses, and life changes, not just the death of a loved one. This is crucial. Life is a continuing series of separations and losses, large and small. Every life event on the familiar Holmes-Rahe stress scale involves some loss and therefore some grieving, and how we handle this is thus crucial. There is evidence that some psychosomatic illnesses are related to unhealed grief, the same being true for much of alcoholism and other addictive illnesses. Studies have shown that many people become physically sick following the death of a loved one. A great many more hospital patients have had a recent bereavement than people in the general population. And in psychiatric hospitals, about 6 times as many are recently bereaved than in the general population. There is a virtual epidemic of unhealed and largely unrecognized grief wounds in most congregations and communities, working devastating havoc." Grief, the experience of loss, such an unavoidable experience of life, yet also such a painful, difficult, and potentially destructive one. Why on earth would Jesus say such a thing is blessed? Blessed are those who mourn. Right? What is he trying to tell us in this? Few thoughts. First, Jesus tells us here that loss is a fact of life. As just noted, life is a series of separations and losses, large and small. That is, right off the top, we need to understand that as we talk about being in mourning, about grieving, we're not simply talking about the experience of death of a loved one, but rather that all life is filled with a whole bunch of these losses. The loss of a job, or changing jobs, moving, divorce, graduation, children growing up and moving on, children growing up and moving back, or whatever, Whether desired or not, all of these and more are a series of losses and changes that we must contend with. And in this, note how the second Beatitude begins by simply reinforcing all this as being a part of life. That is, Jesus does not say, if you should happen to mourn, if by chance loss should happen upon you, you will be comforted. No. It's just, blessed are those who mourn. Loss stated as almost a matter of fact. And in fact, the unspoken subtext that drives this beatitude from the outset is that grief is going to happen. The verse begins with Jesus establishing loss as a basic fact of life. This is the premise, that grief is a fundamental reality we must face. This, of course, would seem to be obvious. We know it logically. But it points us toward the first problem that we all tend to have with grief, the first way we so often run into trouble with it, namely, we try to avoid, if not outright deny, the reality of the losses in our lives. We do this in various ways. Some completely refuse to believe altogether that some loss has occurred, such pathological denial potentially being or leading to true mental illness. Others, while less profoundly in denial, still desperately spend all their time simply trying to keep any of the normal losses of life from happening to them, this ultimately keeping them from truly living. And all of us, in varying degrees, often simply try to deny the full reality of some losses' effect upon us. Its pain, its hurt, its life changes. But whatever and all, the first step in ever coming to truly deal with and heal grief is to face the reality of it. It's like the familiar 5 stages of grief. The first stage is shock. You experience a loss, and at first you just sort of feel numb, even over a loss that you were maybe expecting, It's almost as if you don't feel anything, like you're just going through the motions of life, almost outside of yourself. It's all not quite real. Preacher Charles Stanley, he calls this heavenly Novocaine that God administers to enable us to survive the extreme pain at the moment of the loss. However, this heavenly Novocaine very quickly wears off when we enter into stage 2, which is denial. The reality begins to set in, but we don't want it to be real. We try to fend it off however we can. Again, Stanley writes, "It seems significant that the most often used response to bad news is, 'Oh no.' That is a verbal response of a soul saying, 'No, this just cannot happen. It only happens to others.' We try to hold off reality, minimize its effects, if not outright, reject it. Frequently, this denial involving, a certain amount of bargaining. Oh Lord, if I do this, that, or the other thing, will you make this stop? Will you make it not happen? Will you ease my pain? When this denial and bargaining fails to work, we then enter into stage 3, which is generally marked by anger. In the loss of a job, we lash out at the corporation. In the loss of a marriage, we lash out at our ex-spouse. In the loss of a loved one, we lash out at God or the doctors or even at the deceased, for having left us without them. The point in all being, I have been hurt deeply and somebody needs to pay. It's only natural. This anger, though, at times it eases, then giving way to stage 4. It's depression. The sadness of the new painful situation that is upon us starts to really take hold of us. All leading finally, hopefully, into stage 5, which is acceptance. The grieving person finally accepts the loss as real. In the end, note how the point throughout is first and foremost to come to acceptance of this reality, the reality of the situation. This is what Jesus does here in the second Beatitude. He begins by stating that loss is a reality we must face, that we must accept. However, I would note he adds an extra little wrinkle to this. He lets us in on the fact that there are actually two sides to the reality of any loss that we needed to accept. Yes, the loss, but also the life beyond it. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Will be, that's future tense. That's something more. In effect, loss is a reality, yes, but so is the fact that it is not the end. Right? The first step in coping with grief is accepting the reality of it, the full reality, that the loss is real and that the loss is not the end. So often we short-circuit one or both of these. We get ourselves into all sorts of trouble. Maybe we refuse to accept the full reality of the loss we have experienced. Or even in fully accepting that, allowing ourselves to drift into total despair, wrongfully assuming that now is all hopeless. Everything's hopeless. It's all over. Wrong. A parishioner once sent me the following email story, and it reads like this. An Illinois man left the snow-filled streets of Chicago for a vacation in Florida. His wife was on a business trip and was planning to meet him there the next day. When he reached his hotel, he decided to send his wife a quick email. Unable to find the scrap of paper on which he had written her email address, he did the best to type it in from memory. Unfortunately, he missed one letter, and his note was directed instead to an elderly preacher's wife whose husband had died only the day before. When the grieving widow checked her email, she took one look at the monitor, let out a piercing scream, and fell to the floor unconscious. At the sound, her family rushed into the room and saw this note on the screen. It read, "Dearest wife, just checked in. Everything prepared for your arrival tomorrow. P.S. It sure is hot down here." Right? Quite often we get the wrong message, right? Mark Twain once said, "Why is it that we rejoice at a birth and grieve at a funeral? It is because we are not the person involved. We get it all backwards because we are outside the life and not in it." You see, we get sad because we don't see the whole picture. We lose sight of the full reality. Loss, but life beyond. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Yes, loss is real and painful and rough, but in Christ it is never the end. This is the whole point of the resurrection. This is the whole picture. We need to force ourselves to face up to both realities. A noted preacher puts it this way: we are ever being born or dying, and the thrill of choosing which is ours. Only once must we be born without our own consent, and only once must we die without our own permission. We are always dying or rising, the thrill of choosing which is ours, This is the premise of the text, that loss is a reality, but life beyond loss is also a reality. Jesus here first seeks to comfort us with the fact of loss, and in this to ask of us, in the unhealed griefs and losses in our own lives, to ask, how are we refusing to accept the full reality of our situation? Either the full reality of the pain and what it demands of us, or the full reality of how life continues and how it calls us to live today. We're either not completely facing the hurt, which is crucial, without which we can never really become alive, or we're just giving up. And that's not right. That's not life either. One author writes, "As I prayed, I said, 'God, I hurt.' And God said, 'I know.' I said, 'God, I cry a lot.' And God said, 'That is why I gave you tears.' I said, 'God, I am so depressed.' And God said, that is why I gave you sunshine. I said, God, life is so hard. And God said, that is why I gave you loved ones. I said, God, my loved one died. And God said, so did mine. I said, God, it's such a loss. And God said, I saw mine nailed to a cross. I said, God, but your loved one lives. And God said, so does yours. I said, God, where are they now? And God said, mine is on my right hand and yours is in the light. I said, God, I miss them. And God said, I know. But worry not, for the second coming of mine is close at hand. And when you look back, it will all be just the twinkling of an eye. The first thing that Jesus seeks to tell us here, that loss is a fact of life. Do not deny the full reality, the pain or the hope. Which leads us into the second thing that Jesus wants us to know here. Grief must be entered into to find healing. Have you ever heard the story of the tourist in Vienna, Austria, who was going through a graveyard one day when all of a sudden he hears some music? No one is around, so he starts searching for the source. He finally locates the origin and finds it coming from a grave with a headstone that reads, Ludwig van Beethoven, 1770 to 1827. Then he realizes that the music is Beethoven's Ninth Symphony and that it is being played backwards. Puzzled, he leaves the graveyard and he persuades a friend to return with him. By the time they arrive back at the grave, the music has changed. This time it is the Seventh Symphony, but like the previous piece, it's being played backward. Curious, the men agree to consult a music scholar. When they return with the expert, the Fifth Symphony is playing again backwards. The expert notices that the symphonies are being played in the reverse order in which they are composed, the Ninth, the Seventh, the Fifth. By the next day, the word is spread and a great crowd is gathered around the grave. They are all listening to the Second Symphony being played backwards. Just then, the graveyard's caretaker ambles up to the group, and someone in the crowd asks him if he has an explanation for this music. Oh, it's nothing to worry about, folks, says the caretaker. Beethoven is just decomposing. Sorry. Couldn't resist that one. That's a bad one. But the point, loss is a process that must be entered into. Something of our second point here today. Returning to the text, notice how Jesus says, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Note the inference. It is only those who mourn who are comforted. Or conversely, if when we experience loss, we reject and refuse to mourn, we will then miss out on the comfort. We will fail to receive it, which unfortunately is exactly what far too many people do every single day. Jesus here, secondly, is trying to teach us a basic life skill, that building upon the premise that loss is a reality we must accept to get well, to know comfort, we must have to be willing to mourn, to enter into our pain, to feel it and to express it and to get it out, The grief, no matter what its form or cause, is never just an event, a static, isolated moment, a static, isolated experience, but rather is always a process that must be entered into and worked through. I recently read that in the Chinese city of Nanjing, one of the most popular night spots sports only a sofa, a few tables, and tissues, a lot of tissues. The AP News Service reports that the city's first cry bar, where customers can sit and cry for $6 an hour, is growing in popularity. Owner Lu Jun says he opened the bar when clients of his last business said they often wanted to cry, but due to Asian culture and practices, didn't know when or where it would be appropriate to do so. You see, they recognize their need to enter into the pain in their lives and to express it, to get it out. They're doing it in a way that may kind of seem strange to us, but the point is still valid. As a great philosopher once said, a suppressed grief chokes and seethes within, multiplying its strength. He that conceals his grief finds no remedy for it. It's a crucial second step here. The absolute need to enter into grief, to feel it, to express it, to share it in tears, in talking, in praying, or whatever, to not bottle it up. Right? And in this, I would just note a couple of things. First, that grief takes time. Right? It's not some automatic thing. It's a process. It takes time, most often years. We often try to rush it, to force it, and that's not healthy. Second, we need to remember that each person grieves differently. We need to allow for that, not make ourselves crazy, For instance, have you ever experienced the death, say, of someone very close to you? But for some unknown reason, you felt no desire to cry over it, right? Maybe you start feeling even bad about that, right? Like there's something wrong with you. And maybe others even start questioning, did they really care, Well, maybe the tears will just come later somewhere else or not at all, but whatever. The trick is not to have to do what someone else has done, but to do simply what you feel moved to do and to know that that's okay. And from this, then, thirdly and most importantly, to remember that virtually all grief entails guilt. This makes it so tough. Grief of all kinds is most commonly marked by guilt. No matter what the loss, our thoughts become consumed with all the if-onlys and the I should-haves and the why didn't I's and why didn't they's and why did I's or why did they's, It's very natural and normal. We human beings have a constant need to find reasons for everything that happens to us. The important thing to remember, however, is that even though sometimes such guilty thoughts may contain some small element of truth, in grief, due to the pain acting almost like a giant prism that warps our vision, the guilt is almost always out of total proportion to reality. This is particularly true, for example, say of people who care for an extremely ill loved one for a very long time, leading up to that person's death. Invariably, after months, maybe even years of constant caregiving, there are those thoughts late at night, I wish they just dropped dead. It's thoughts partly for them, but mostly for oneself. And then after the death, there's all this guilt, Shouldn't have thought that. Too ashamed to even admit that they'd ever even had such thoughts, when in reality, not to have such thoughts would have been abnormal. We're human. God understands and God forgives, right? Working through grief takes time. Everyone is different. It requires facing some of the toughest thoughts and feelings we might have, but we must enter into it if we are ever to be healed. The text, secondly, asks of us in our grief, are we truly entering into it, experiencing it, expressing it, expelling it? Preacher Bill Hybels, in his book, A Better Kind of Grieving, writes, I had a 3-hour lunch with a seasoned Christian counselor this week. I asked her to talk to me about grieving. I asked her to tell me what she advises people to do when they're dealing with loss, and she said, of course I tell them to feel their feelings, but then I also urge people to reduce radically the pace of their lives. I urge them to review their loss, to talk about it openly, to think about it thoroughly, to write about it reflectively, and to pray through it. It is my experience that people want to run from their pain. They want to replace pain with another feeling as soon as they can. To recover from pain, you have to face it. You must stand in it and process it before it will dissipate. And that is God's way. Says Hybels, I didn't do that when my father died. I replaced that pain real fast. I think I missed only 4 days at work. And I just replaced the feeling of loss and disappointment with a frenzied ministry schedule, and I ran from it. That was a bad move for me and for other people around me. I wonder how many of us do that. Anybody running from pain today? Are you trading in your pain prematurely for some other feeling? It's not God's way, and it's deadly. Think of it like this. 50 plus years ago, industrialists thought that they could just bury toxic waste and it would go away. We have since learned that it doesn't just go away. It makes a lot of trouble. It leaks into the water table, it contaminates crops, and it kills animals. Buried grief does the same thing. Raw time doesn't heal a thing. Buried pain leaks into our emotional system and wreaks havoc there. It distorts our perceptions of life and it taints our relationships. That contamination happens subconsciously. We have to get it out. Golda Meir once said, I have always felt sorry for people afraid of feeling, of sentimentality, who are unwilling to weep with their whole hearts, because those who do not do this, because they do not weep, they do not ever laugh either. The second thing Jesus wants to tell us here is that grief must be entered into to find healing. Which brings us to finally the third thing that Jesus wants us to know here is that to mourn is to know how to live. In the end, notice how Jesus does not say, blessed are those who mourn, for they will get over it. Right? Isn't that interesting? And isn't it somewhat annoying? Isn't getting over our grief the main thing we all ultimately want in this? But Jesus never says that those who mourn will get over their loss. He merely says that they will be comforted within it. Is this finally just a cop-out, a hint of the Almighty's ultimate inability in the face of life's real difficulties? No. This is finally the most important and ultimately the most blessed message here, that grief is never done. Now that sounds like a pretty lousy message. So what's the good news in it? Well, think about it. When we mourn, what does it say? It says that we know that we have received something of great value that we now miss. God doesn't take that pain away, you see, because to take it away would mean to take away the gift of it. To feel no pain, to forget, would be to have never received. So while it hurts, it remains. And this points us straight toward our final lesson here today, namely, that grief finally isn't something you get over. It's something you readjust to and move on with. As many pastoral counselors note, the final stage of the grief process is that you emotionally relocate the person or thing lost and get on with your life. That is, everything in our lives occupies some place and provides some function for us that enables us to live. When one of those pieces is lost, the whole structure must shift, must readjust to fill that gap. Now, obviously, this is a huge and very difficult task. This is why we fear it so. But ironically, the ability to mourn is finally the secret to the whole thing. It's like this. The ability to mourn, the actual experience of grief experiences a tremendously great thing. Not only as stated that we receive something of great value, a gift, but that we also gave ourselves to that gift. We gave our hearts to it. We committed ourselves to it. We cared for it and we held it. All of this being ultimately just exactly what it is to truly be alive. To see the tremendous gift of life and to give yourself wholeheartedly to it. Now, of course, we've been hurt by this, burned by it, so we're afraid to do it again. But we must and can. We can refuse it, but to do so is to cease to live. The very fact that we mourn is telling us that we know how to live and that we are able to do it. One scholar puts it this way. A woman came to me and said, "I lost a loved one nearly a year ago. When will it stop hurting?" And the question was simple but difficult to answer. She was challenging me. I wanted to help her, but I knew that only she could answer that question. Whenever someone writes to tell me about a death, I always talk about the difficult months ahead. I refer to it as the year of firsts. The first holiday, birthday, anniversary, summer picnic, or other personal event without the loved one. Then there are those little things you never really paid attention to before, but now find a gaping hole right in the middle of your day. Like the time that they woke up each morning, how they had their coffee, the sound the door made around dinner time when they arrived home, and the way they said hello. But there's something about this woman's question that made me stop and really think about what I needed to say. Oddly, I decided that the pain she was feeling was a good thing, but I wasn't sure she wanted to know that. And here's exactly what I wrote to her. When will you stop hurting? That is a measure of the love you shared. And how does one measure love? Well, by remembering them long after they are gone. Memories are the shadows of a life well lived that remain long after the light of their being has gone out. May you never forget. Pain is the echo of remembering those special moments when all the world belonged to both of you. The day will come when the pain of remembering turns into understanding the privilege of ever having them in your life at all. Remembering will be a joy. Although the pain is great at times, you are reminded still how very much you loved and were loved. May the rest of your life be a reflection of that love, and when your time comes, may your passing cast long shadows for all who loved you too. This is when we are done grieving, when we return to investing ourselves into life once again. When the pain remains, at times extreme pain, it's just that we see the gift of it. And from that, the gift of life in general, we return to investing ourselves in that gift of life, giving ourselves once again to it. That is done. Christian author Rex Humbard, he tells the story of a woman who was released from the hospital after extensive rounds of therapy that failed to turn back the progress of a deadly disease. Confined to her bed at home, the woman received regular visits from her physician, but she could not work up the courage to explain her illness to her 6-year-old daughter. One morning, however, the little girl overheard the doctor speaking gravely with her mother and father. "I'll be honest with you, Karen," the physician said. "You don't have much time. I don't think you'll survive the autumn." A few days later, the mother glanced out the bedroom window and saw something that nearly broke her heart. She watched as her daughter stooped to pick up the leaves that had begun to fall in the September breeze. And then, as if to try to halt the force of nature itself, the little girl worked to Scotch tape each leaf back onto a branch. She was going to stop autumn. The woman sent her husband out to talk to their daughter. Through many tears, he explained to the little girl that this couldn't be stopped, but that Mommy would live on in heaven. From her room, the mother saw the two hug as the little girl looked up toward her window. In November, the mother died. The daughter had understood her father's words, but she was not the same. A once very outgoing girl, vivacious and energetic, now she was quiet and reserved. Most especially a girl who used to love to be outside riding her bicycle, but now she spent most of her time alone in her room. The months passed. One spring morning, the father suddenly heard his daughter call out, "Daddy, Daddy, come here, come quick." The father, worried that his daughter was in trouble, he had hurt herself, he raced to her side. He found her simply sitting in the living room, staring out the window. "Look, Daddy, look," she said. "The leaves are back on the tree again. Even though the leaves fell, the tree still lives." "Yes, sweetheart," said the father as he looked at the tree his daughter had tried to tape the leaves back onto. "Even though the leaves fell, the tree still lives." "Just like Mommy?" said the daughter. "Yes, just like Mommy," said the father. The girl looked at the tree. "Can I ride my bike, Daddy?" the little girl asked. "Sure," answered the father. And with that, the little girl went out to the garage and got her bicycle and joyfully rode down the tree-lined street, alive with the colors of spring. Earth has no sorrow that heaven cannot heal. Grief, the pain of loss, the deepest hurt a heart can know. What loss do you struggle with this day? The second beatitude, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. A promise showing us the way through. Remember, loss is a fact of life. Grief must be entered into, and to mourn is to know how to live. Let us join together in singing our closing hymn, number 128, He Leadeth Me. We will sing verses 1, 2, and 4. Would you please stand?